Hello and welcome to the Code Maven channel. My name is Gabor. I teach Python and Rust and some other stuff. In this video, we are going to take a look at the raise exception statement of Python with a from, an extension of from, which is something I haven't seen earlier. Just now I was reading some code and was surprised to see it, and so I wanted to understand what's going on. So what you see on the screen is just an example I wrote. But let's take a look at how usually you raise an exception. So in most cases I've seen is this first line that I'm trying to highlight now. That's the only thing that you are writing. So only this one, that actually if I highlight this one, it highlights everywhere, doesn't matter. So this is what you normally write when you're raising some exception. Obviously, you might do some more specific exceptions, not just generic exception, value error or whatever, or you might have your own type of error exceptions. That's fine, but that's it. Now, what I saw is this line, okay? So I saw this raise exception, something, and then from none. And I was trying to understand what this none is. So I went on, read a little bit more, and then I saw that in some other cases, what people write is this. From exception, blah, blah, something, and then from the raise exception, sorry, and then from, and then they give here the error that was captured by this exception handling. So these forms, this is none and the ERR, are usually seen inside an exception handler itself. Okay, so I wrote an example where the main script, the main program, receives either the value default, none, or same, and depending on the input, it will use one of these exception handling methods, okay? And the default one I put here, or so it's not really the right word here. So the fourth case is when I raise an exception, and then in the from, I write another exception. And I just sort of added it for the fun. I don't think that this is a really usually used way to do it, but anyway. So what does this program do? It gets the command line option, default, none, or same, and then passes in, then it has an exception handler, okay? And it calls a function called upper with the appropriate parameter. Now the upper function will call another function called lower. So think about it, it's a hierarchy of functions, just as you normally have in your code. The main function calls some function, and that calls some other function, and so on. And somewhere beneath there, something raises an exception. So in this case, the lower function is what raises an exception. And again, in normal circumstances, this would be on some condition, and the exception itself would be something more clever, and not just the generic exception in most cases. But for example, I said it's enough to raise an exception and I don't need to have any condition here. So there is somewhere in the middle of the stack trace, the call stack, somewhere in the middle or at the top, you have a try except statement where you try to call this lower function, and then if it raised some exception, then you do something with it. And now, if you don't know how to really handle that exception at that point, then you probably raise a new exception and throw it higher up. Maybe we just say raise ERR to raise the exception, the same exception, and throw it further up. But in this case, what we see is that we raise an exception and we generate a new exception from upper. Or from upper and then from none is an extra parameter, or we raise this. Now let's see what happens. And in the main function, I had basically two cases here. One of them that we catch the exception in upper and then print out three things: the exception itself, so the text of the exception, and then two attributes: what was the cause and what was the context. And later on, we'll see what happens if we enable this and we just call the function and the exception exits the program. So I'm going to run the program now, and I think this is how I need to run. So if I call it with the first parameter, which is default, This is how it behaves when the normal way you write it. So just raise exception, nothing else. It says the starting lower is there all the time. Maybe I should remove it anyway. Okay, I'm going to remove it. That's not that interesting here. Okay, so let's start it again. I run it, and this is the three values I got. Now the other case, let's go, which is the second case, is when we have none there. In this case, when we said from none, the difference here, you can see there's no difference, okay? There's no difference between this and this in these parts of the exception, whether you pass it the none or not. The next one would be the same. So I use the word same because I'm just passing from the same exception. And here, what you could see is that the exception is lower. So you can see that this is what caused the exception in the lower function. And the last one is actually I added it because I made a mistake by myself. But what if you write here something else, for example, kukuriku, or just anything else? So basically, nothing happened. Nothing is. This will happen, and in this case, you see basically the same, except that now the cause is incorrect input. So this is the cause. So basically, this is the cause, and the other one is the context. Okay, so this happens when you run the program, you run the function, and catch it is the exception handler. Now let's turn it around, and instead of that, just call the upper function and see what happens when it raises an exception. So we start with the default. In the default case, this is the exception we see, and you're familiar with this, I guess. It's annoying when you have an exception, and it says during handling of the above exception, there was another exception. So basically, this is the exception that was raised by the lower function, okay? And then while we were handling the exception, so inside the except part of the code, we had another exception, and this is the other exception. And I really don't like this when it happens, but this is what we get from such code, okay? So what happens if the programmer wrote none there? This is what we are going to get then, none, okay? So in this case, we don't have the two parts of the exception, only one. It doesn't say, it's only, so what now we only see the exception, this exception. We don't see the exception that was caught here. Now, whether it's good or bad, that's you have to decide. But this is what this none does. Okay, let's see the next one. So the next one is if I type in same, and then basically we run exception, and then from and provide here as the context the same exception that we caught. And this is almost the same as we had in the default case, except that the text here is different. So if I scroll up a little bit, you can see that this says during handling of the above exception, there was a new exception. There's another one. In our case now, it says the above exception was the direct cause of the following exception. Okay, so it's sort of the other way around. Let me see if it will also print out the other way. No, so the first part is one where we say exception in lower, and the second part is the from upper, and here down, if you go scroll down, the same. Okay, so just basically, I think just this line is different between the default thing and between the one that when you provide the same. And so what happens in the last case when I type here something else, and it doesn't really matter what, but I like kukuriku. So in this case, we only get one exception apparently. Okay. It says exception incorrect input here, and that's one stack trace, sorry. So we have the exception incorrect input here, and then it says, oh, right, now I understand. Okay, so you do get the two sort of stack traces, but the first one is really, really short. So you only have the exception part because this one didn't have any stack trace from this point, just the exception itself. And then the above exception was direct. That's the same as in the previous case. And then you have the from upper, so this exception you can see. So you can see that this from part allows you to provide slightly different information for the user or hide the information from the lower exception. I guess it might be useful if you're calling from some external library and you don't want to show the details of that the details of the exception received from that external library that you used somewhere deep in your code base. Instead, you want to have only your part of the exception. And in that, you might include some information, some details from what really happened, but you don't want to provide the deep one because your developers can't really do much, can't really fix the code of the third-party library. Well, they can because if it's open source and they can send in a pull request. But the idea is that that's not the main focus. So that's it, I think. I hope that this helped. And please like the video, thumbs up, and follow the channel so you'll be notified with the little bell when we get new videos. So see you in the next video. Bye-bye.